So here you are, you're flipping around the internet, looking at various videos, and you discover, oh, Jim has posted yet another theological video. Let's go see what he's talking about. And lo and behold, he's talking about the number 1,000 in Revelation 20. And honestly, do we really need another video about that? Why in the world would Jim jump into the middle of that fray? Well, it's because I want to take a particular look at one particular aspect of the number 1,000 in Revelation 20. Let me tell you what inspired this particular video. I was listening to a relatively well-known online post-millennial guy, and he stated rather categorically that all the numbers in Revelation 20 are symbolic. That's as close to a quote as I can come. All the numbers in Revelation 20 are symbolic. And therefore, it is no surprise that the number 1,000 in Revelation 20 is also symbolic. It doesn't mean literally 1,000. It is some large expanse of numbers. And that really caught my attention. I thought I really do need to kind of point out that there's no valid argument there. And so that's what this particular video is about. If that interests you, then stick around. If not, I'm sure there are lots of other videos here on YouTube that you can go look at. By the way, if you find this kind of content engaging or helpful or theologically stimulating, I'm supposed to tell you to subscribe. And apparently there's a button you can click where you'll be informed whenever I put up new videos. All right, so all that out of the way, let's have a look at the numbers in the book of Revelation. Let's do some graphics, and I'll be right back. The best place to start a conversation about anything is at the beginning, and I like definitions. So let's define the term 1,000 years. In the Greek, it is the word kilioi, which does mean, in fact, 1,000, which is why every respected notable translation of the Bible translates that word as 1,000. When you put it together with aetos, or years, you get 1,000 years. When that moved into the Latin language, it began with the word milli for 1,000. To this very day, we use the word millimeter, which means 1,000th of a meter. So we're still familiar with that Latin language. When you put that together with annum, or year, from which we get words like annual, which means yearly, you get millennium, and that is where we get our English word millennium. It is just moved from the Greek into the Latin, into the English language. And as I said, there's no question about what the definition of the words is. Clearly, it means 1,000 years, which is why every translation goes with 1,000 years. So now that we know what the phrase means, is it meant to be taken literally, like in a mathematic form, or does that actually convey some allegorical, symbolic concept, such as a long period of time of no determinate length? Oftentimes, you'll hear people who have a vested interest in making sure that it's not a literal 1,000 years, you will hear them argue that the ancient Greeks didn't have a real expansive numeric system. When they were counting, 1,000 was about as big as they could conceive. So when they said 1,000, they always meant just some big uncountable number. So we have to ask again, but does the Bible actually ever define mathematically what it means when it uses the word 1,000? And fortunately, the answer is yes, it absolutely does. In fact, it's very, very early on in the Bible. The Israelites were so good at counting that there is a book in the Pentateuch known as Numbers, which is full of counts and counting. And in that book, we actually do discover a working mathematic definition for the number 1,000. And my assumption is John, being familiar with the scripture, would at very least know when he used the word 1,000 that the definition already existed. So let's take a quick look at that. The book of Numbers, chapter 31, and I'm going to start reading at verse 25. Then the Lord, Yahweh, spoke to Moses, saying, You and Eleazar the priest, and the heads of your fathers' households of the congregation, take account of the booty that was captured, both of man and of animal, and divide the booty between the warriors who went out to battle and all the congregation. Levy a tax for the Lord from the men of war who went out to battle, 1 in 500 of the persons, and of the cattle, and of the donkeys, and of the sheep. Take it from their half, and give it to Eleazar the priest as an offering to the Lord. From the sons of Israel's half, you shall take 1 drawn out of every 50 of the persons, of the cattle, of the donkeys, and of the sheep, from all the animals, and give them to the Levites, who keep charge of the tabernacle of the Lord. Moses and Eleazar the priest did just as the Lord had commanded Moses. Now the booty that remained from the spoil which the men of war had plundered was 675,000 sheep, and 72,000 cattle, and 61,000 donkeys, and of the human beings, of the women who had not known a man intimately, all the persons were 32,000. The half, the portion of those who went out to war, was as follows. The number of sheep was 337,500, and the Lord's levy of the sheep was 675. And the cattle were 36,000, from which the Lord's levy was 72. And the donkeys were 30,500, from which the Lord's levy was 61. And the human beings were 16,000, from whom the Lord's levy was 32 persons. Moses gave the levy, which was the Lord's offering, to Eleazar the priest, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. As for the sons of Israel's half, which Moses separated from the men who had gone to war, now the congregation's half was 337,500 sheep, and 36,000 cattle, and 30,500 donkeys. And the human beings were 16,000. And from the sons of Israel's half, Moses took 1 drawn out of every 50, both of man and of animals, and gave them to the Levites, who kept charge of the tabernacle, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. Now the reason that I read all that from the book of Numbers is because I want you to recognize what just happened mathematically in that section. The total number of sheep was 61,000. Divide that in half and you get 30,500. So what does that tell you about what they considered 1,000 to be? It was 500 times 2. If you divide 1,000 by 2, you get 500. That is mathematic specificity in defining the number 1,000. And that's way back in the Pentateuch. So my contention is that John would be familiar with that, and when he used the word 1,000, he would know its mathematic definition. He would understand that it is 500 times 2. He'd be using the word specifically and mathematically, not as a reference to some large, indistinguishable number, which, by the way, John also had word usage for, and actually employed that same word usage in the book of Revelation. We'll look at all that by the end of this video. Anyone who has listened to any of these videos of mine has probably heard me mention what I refer to as a face value hermeneutic. And all I mean by that phrase is that I assume that the words on the page of the Bible are the words that the original author chose to use because those words best convey the meaning that he was trying to bring across. In other words, if he had meant something else, he'd have said something else. Now, John used that term, 1,000 years, 6 times at the beginning of the book of Revelation. And I contend that whatever he meant the first time, he also meant all 6 times that he used it. In other words, he didn't change meanings midstream as he employed the terminology of 1,000 years. So by the time you get to Revelation 20, the book of Revelation has already included so many numbers. And the contention by the post-mill fellow that I was listening to online was that all the numbers in the book of Revelation are symbolic, and therefore the number 1,000 is a symbolic number. Let's take a look at some of the numbers in the book of Revelation and see if they actually are symbolic or are they actual mathematic terms, because if we employ that same rule of interpretation, if it turns out that the numbers in Revelation are meant specifically and mathematically, then ipso facto, the number 1,000 in Revelation 20 is equally mathematic and specific. So let's take a look at some of those numbers. Right from the very beginning of the book, John is told to write 7 letters to the 7 churches of Asia. And then those churches are delineated. They are named, and it turns out that there are 7 of them. And as a consequence, the beginning of the book of Revelation, the first 3 chapters, include letters to those churches, and there are indeed 7 letters for the 7 churches. When Jesus appears and speaks to John, he has in his hand the 7 stars, or the 7 messengers to those 7 churches, and he is standing amidst 7 candlesticks. And the description and the use of that number 7 every single time is accurate. In other words, he doesn't say, write 7 letters, and then John writes 13, or some indistinguishable number. In fact, the details of the book tell us that it's 7 and 7 and 7, and then once we see the details, we see the number of letters, we see the church's name by name, then it is indeed 777. So that is mathematically accurate. That's my point. Or in the book of Revelation, John mentions 42 months, and then he defines those 42 months as 1,260 days. On the Jewish lunar calendar of 12 months made up of 30 days each, that is mathematically accurate. 1,260 days is indeed 42 months. So John is speaking mathematically. He is creating an equation. It is an accurate mathematic equation, and we to this very day would agree with his sums and the way that he calculated that. As well, John talks about the 144,000. Then he tells us that that number is made up of 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. So that would be 12 times 12,000, which actually mathematically, check your calculators, is 144,000. In other words, so far, John is using numbers mathematically and accurately. Now listen, we can debate all we want about the 7 stars in Christ's hand and argue about what these stars may signify. Or we can talk about the 144,000. I'm not sure why that's a debate, given that John says it's each of the 12 tribes of Israel and then spells them out by name, and it turns out that there are actually 12. But if you want to debate about who those 12 tribes of people are and what they represent, that doesn't change the fact that the numbers themselves, the 7 or the 144,000 or the 1,260 days, those numbers are all used accurately and mathematically. You may argue about the meaning of what there is a number of 7 of, or what the 1,260 days represent. You may argue about who the 144,000 are. Nevertheless, the numbers themselves are not symbolic. They are specific and they are mathematic. And that's what you see, in fact, all the way through the book of Revelation, is an accurate number. For instance, the book of Revelation talks about the 2 witnesses. Well, how many are there? There's 2. Now, we can argue about who those 2 witnesses are. We can debate about what they do, whether they're the final 2 witnesses, what they signify, but we're still talking about 2 characters, 2 people, because the number 2 is still the accurate mathematic number of the witnesses. All I'm driving at is that the statement that all the numbers in the book of Revelation are symbolic and therefore the number 1,000 is symbolic doesn't actually measure up to what we find in the details of the book. In fact, all the numbers in the book of Revelation are accurate mathematic numbers. Regardless of what we say other things may represent or what the symbology is about, it's still accurate numbers. And that's what I'm getting at. So when John talks about 1,000 in Revelation, is he speaking mathematically and accurately, or is he speaking about some large indeterminate number? If John had meant to say an actual mathematic 1,000 of something, like years, what would he have said? What word would he have used? He would have used kilioi, which in fact he did. If he had meant to say some large indeterminate number, did he have a word at his disposal that actually meant large indeterminate number? Well, the answer is yes. There is the Greek word myrios, from which we get myriad, just a large number of things. So then the question is, did John know that word, and had he ever used it? And the answer again is yes. He actually used it in this very same letter in the book of Revelation. In Revelation 5:11, he looked and he saw this gathering of many angels around the throne and the living creatures, of which, by the way, there were 4, and the elders, of which, by the way, there were 24. Now, we may argue for a moment about why 24, but the fact is there are 24. Nobody argues about that. Every translation says that there are 24 elders. And John is enumerating all of them. But when he gets to the point of seeing this large group of people, he says there are myriads of myriads, myrios, and larger times larger numbers, thousands upon thousands, kilios, and myrios. In other words, John knows how to say large, indistinguishable, uncountable number. And when he means to convey that, he does not use the word kilioi. He does not say 1,000, because that's what that means. Instead, when he's speaking of a large number, he employs myrios and then multiplicities of thousands. But when talking about 1,000 years, he in fact says 1,000 years. So if we're going to allow John to say what he wants to say and use the words that he wants to use to convey the meaning that he wants to convey, then we have to say back in chapter 5, he meant to say a really large indistinguishable number. But in chapter 20, he meant to say 1,000 years, because that's what he said. you get to the end of the book of Revelation, and you see New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven. And New Jerusalem is built on 12 foundation stones. And there are names on those foundation stones, the names of the 12 apostles. Oh yeah, how many apostles did Jesus have? Oh, that's right, 12. So that's mathematically accurate. But then there are also 12 gates. And the 12 gates have the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. And how many tribes of Israel were there? It turns out there were 12. And so before you get to Revelation 20, you see John employ mathematic accuracy, whether talking about 7 or 2 or 24 or 4 or 144 or 1,260 being 42 months. All through the book of Revelation, John demonstrates that he knows how to count and how to do math. After Revelation 20, you see the same thing demonstrated in the 12s of the foundations, in the 12s of the gates. So there is simply no exegetical reason to come to the conclusion that Revelation 20 is meant to be taken non-specifically, especially if your argument is based on the notion that the rest of the numbers in the book of Revelation are symbolic. The fact is, the numbers in the book of Revelation have mathematic specificity, and therefore we have to conclude that the numbers in Revelation 20 are also mathematically specific. And that's really all I'm driving at in this video and why it exists. So I look forward to your feedback. Thank you for listening. Thanks for dialing us up again. Bye.